Texas. The sprawling plains, the towering canyons, the tangled thickets, and the restless coastline. For most, it's a place of big skies and bigger dreams. Yet, beyond the sun-scorched highways and tourist stops, there are reports of people being terrorized by the dark shapes that rise from the deep. These are tales and encounters so inexplicable, they threaten our very notions of what lurks out there in the wild Texas night. Now, get ready to brace yourself for 3 harrowing accounts that plunge headlong into fear and the unknown. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. I've heard countless stories that made my skin crawl, but this one seems different. An echo from dark corners of the desert night, ushering in a sense of dread that refuses to let go. Perhaps it's the isolation of the Guadalupe Mountains, perched along the northern border of the Chihuahuan Desert in Texas, or maybe it's something older lurking among those limestone cliffs. Whatever the reason, what follows is the sort of account that has kept me pacing the floor at all hours. If you find yourself uneasy by the end, well, let's just say you won't be alone. To all who follow these strange chronicles on your favorite YouTube channel, I never imagined myself writing in with a story like this. My name is Samuel, Sam for short, and I've served as a park ranger in Guadalupe Mountains National Park for about 12 years now. I've hiked every trail from Devil's Hall to the Bowl. I've stood by the ruins of the Pinery Station, watched the shadows lengthen around McKittrick Canyon, and I used to think I knew every wildcat, snake, and scorpion that roamed this terrain. Used to. Now, I'm not so sure. A few weeks back, right after the big autumn storms moved through, I was asked to check on a report of weird tracks. They started appearing just off the Bush Mountain Trail, in an area the visitors rarely step foot in, near a wash that usually only flows during flash floods. Officially, there's some concern about mountain lions, maybe even black bears coming over from New Mexico, but these tracks didn't match anything typical. They looked elongated, like a person's foot if the person had grown an extra few inches of bone where they shouldn't have. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I left from Pine Springs Visitor Center around 6:30 in the morning. Figured I'd reach the site by mid-afternoon. There's a certain quiet that falls over that high desert at dawn. The breeze through the sparse pines doesn't just rustle, it kind of whistles in this lonely way that sets the tone for the whole day. I was halfway up the trail when I realized I wasn't feeling like myself. My radio felt heavier than usual. My boots seemed to drag and the air was eerily still. No crickets, no distant crow calls, absolutely nothing. Even the ringtails that occasionally scamper around seemed to have vanished. I reached the location, bent down to examine those odd footprints, and right away, something about them felt wrong. They were shaped like a broad human foot, but each toe had left a sharp indent in the sandy soil, almost like talons. I radioed in, told dispatch I'd found some unusual tracks, though I avoided details. Didn't want them to think I was going batty. That's when I noticed they weren't just a scattered few prints. There was a clear trail leading deeper into the canyon. Now, I'm not a big believer in superstitions, but I've heard campers and hunters toss around stories about strange creatures prowling these mountains at night. The Apaches had their own legends about malevolent spirits near the highest peaks. I always shrugged them off as local lore or confusion with desert predators. But I started following those footprints, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th marker, I got this strangled feeling in my gut, like I was doing something I shouldn't be. The further I trekked, the more I felt watched. The sun above was harsh and relentless, Yet I swear I felt a chill on my neck. That doesn't happen out here in broad daylight in early October. I paused to look around. Rocks, dried grass, a scattering of juniper, nothing else. I turned back to the footprints, and that's when I saw it up on a ridge. Just a flicker of movement, but definitely there. Looked like a figure, tall but gaunt, with skin pulled tight over what might have been a face. It was only for a second, then it ducked behind a boulder. Maybe I was just worn out, I told myself. So I kept moving. People later asked me why I didn't try to photograph it. My phone was in my backpack, and for some reason, the last thing on my mind was documenting the shape. It felt too immediate, too primal, a jolt of sheer suffocating fear. That's not something you normally think about capturing on camera. A little later, I came across an abandoned campsite. The tent was half collapsed, sleeping bag left behind. No sign of anyone, no footprints except those bizarre ones leading around the site. I found a journal on the ground. It belonged to a day hiker from Dallas who'd written about hearing moaning or wailing in the distance a few nights earlier. He'd scrawled a few lines about a pale figure cresting a hill at sunset. Then the entry stopped. It looked like he'd left everything behind in a hurry. I stuffed the journal in my pack, intending to turn it in for lost and found, but a sinking feeling told me this hiker might not turn up. I made my way back to a ridge near the old Pratt cabin site. The evening sun cast those long, distorted shadows across the canyon, shadows that seemed to shift in ways I wasn't used to. That's when I heard it, kind of like a whisper carried on the wind, but heavy and ragged, almost like the sound of panting after a deep run. I froze. The air seemed to go stale. I scanned the area, my heart hammering. A silhouette of something tall, with elongated limbs, stepped out from behind a lone juniper. I wasn't more than 30 yards away. Even from a distance, I could see its eyes. Not deer-like, not cat-like, but human, in a horrifying sort of way, as if a starving human face had contorted into something monstrous. I wanted to call for help, but I couldn't make my mouth form words. I've faced cougars, bears, rattlers, you name it. I've never been petrified like that. And then it vanished into the rocky outcropping, so quick I almost doubted I ever saw it at all. Now, as if that weren't enough, I started hearing rumors from a couple of locals out in Del City. They spoke about an old story, the Wendigo, that supposedly prowled canyons in the far north, but they claimed a traveler from up around Colorado encountered something similar in Texas long ago, describing it as a ravenous spirit that hungers for human flesh. One rancher even told me his grandfather swore he saw something that looked like a skeletal man with antlers, though I saw no antlers on the thing I encountered. It's possible there are multiple variations or forms people have conjured over time, but the descriptions always revolve around a twisted, cannibalistic being that can mimic human voices. I do remember hearing faint calls that sounded almost like my own voice echoing off the canyon walls at one point. It's going to sound absurd, but I swear it repeated the last words I said on the radio, like it was practicing. That alone would be terrifying enough, but something about it was more cunning, more knowing than any wild animal. A few days later, I started an official investigation with another ranger, Peter, who used to be a local ranch hand before joining the Park Service. We wanted to find the missing hiker from Dallas. We interviewed a couple of other hikers at the Pine Springs campground. One man claimed his wife kept dreaming about a creature that whispered her name in the night. Another gentleman from Carlsbad said he'd seen glimpses of something spindly climbing the ridges at dusk. No one had any proof except for a few shaky phone pics of distant silhouettes. Enough to keep me up at night, but not enough to file any formal wildlife incident report. Peter and I scoured the area, but the more we dug in, the more I felt something or someone was always a few steps ahead. We'd find fresh footprints, sometimes half distorted as if the creature was dragging a leg. We discovered carcasses of jackrabbits, half-eaten with a neatness that defied typical scavenger patterns. Even more unsettling, we found small piles of rocks arranged in strange circles, almost ritualistic. That's not exactly in any official park ranger training manual, you know? Well, one evening we decided to stay overnight near Dog Canyon, less visited by the public, but a known route for wildlife crossing from the New Mexico side. Around midnight, we heard this dreadful, raspy howling, more chilling than any coyote or bobcat. Peter looked at me, pale as the moon, and we both grabbed our flashlights. That's when we caught sight of it, barely illuminated by the beam. It stood on the ridge above us, tall, emaciated, but impossibly strong-looking, with a face that glimmered white in the dark. Then it opened its mouth, and though no real words came out, you could sense the intention behind the shriek. I will never forget that moment. I have had nightmares every night since. I couldn't even bring myself to step into the backcountry for several days. You might think I'm losing it, or that I'm weaving a tale. But I still have that hiker's journal, and I still have half a mind to hand it over to some cryptid research group. Maybe they can piece together the puzzle I can't. Now, we reported these events to park management. They told us to keep quiet for the time being, at least until there's more conclusive evidence. I'm not big on conspiracies, but I can't help wonder if there's a reason they're brushing this under the rug. Perhaps the park wants to avoid panic or a slump in visitor numbers. Maybe the story is too bizarre to accept. All I know is I've never felt hunted before, not by any living thing in these parts. I don't know if the missing hiker will ever turn up. We've had smaller search parties combing the region, and so far, nothing. There are rumors swirling that the government might be aware of entities like this haunting remote wilderness areas, but I can't confirm any of that. All I can say is, keep your eyes open if you ever hike these mountains at dusk or dawn. The desert can keep secrets you never dreamed possible. The more you poke around, the more you sense there's something old and hungry watching. I've shared all this with only a few friends, and now all of you on this channel. Maybe it's a warning, or maybe just a desperate attempt to make sense of a situation that's beyond logic. The Guadalupe Mountains aren't just famous for their breathtaking trails, they might also be home to a legend you'd rather never meet face to face. Now, most folks who wander into the Big Thicket National Preserve are after nothing more dangerous than the perfect snapshot of lush East Texas wilderness, or maybe a few feral hogs if you're the hunting type. But every once in a while, something else lurks in those tangled marshes and pine forests, something that won't show up in a guidebook or tourist brochure. It's a place of murky waters and hidden bogs, and perhaps some mysteries that were never meant to be unraveled. I'm Will from Hardin County, Texas, and I've been hunting in the Big Thicket region near Coonsay since I was big enough to handle a rifle. I usually head out before dawn, set up at the edge of the forest near Village Creek. There's a spot not far from the Turkey Creek Trail that offers a good vantage for deer. It's usually quiet aside from the distant hum of insects and the occasional bullfrog. That morning, though, there was this tension hanging in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I remember stepping off the main trail. I've done that 1,000 times. Sometimes the game is better off where there's less foot traffic. But not too far in, I noticed these deep impressions in the soft earth. At first glance, they kind of resembled human footprints, only bigger and oddly angled, almost as if the foot had elongated toes or claws. I crouched down to get a closer look, and that's when I realized I wasn't looking at some typical black bear track smudged by rain. The prints were too narrow at the heel, too wide at the front, and the depth suggested something heavier than any human being I've ever encountered. I grew up hearing old legends about wild men or cryptid creatures that roam the thicket. Some folks talk about Bigfoot sightings. Others mention something older, more dangerous. A rancher once told me about a malevolent spirit that can take on a human-like form, but with a savage hunger that defies nature. He called it a Wendigo, even though I'd mainly heard that term tied to northern woods. The idea of one showing up in Texas sounded downright ridiculous at the time. But suddenly, kneeling there beside those footprints, I started to wonder if maybe the rancher's stories weren't so far-fetched. My mind was racing. I knew I needed to keep my senses sharp, so I moved on carefully. A little further in, I found a patch of broken branches that looked like they'd been snapped off at an impossible height. That's when the first wave of dread washed over me. I've tracked deer, hog, even stray coyotes. Nothing's ever broken branches like that. Almost 8 feet up, twisted with raw strength. I decided to set up in a new spot, hoping maybe I was just spooking myself. I got into position, scanning the area with binoculars. That's when I noticed an odd figure about 200 yards away near a cluster of cypress trees. It was tall, thin, and seemed to be moving in a way that was both purposeful and unnatural. I couldn't quite see details, just a glimpse of a hunched silhouette before it slipped behind some thick brush. Part of me wanted to follow it, but a bigger part of me was screaming to stay put. I radioed my cousin, who was a mile or so north, to see if he'd seen anything. He'd apparently come across some weird scat that looked like it contained fur, unsure if it belonged to a bobcat or something else. He said he felt uneasy, like someone was standing right behind him, even though he was alone at the time. That only made my uneasiness grow. The day wore on with no sign of normal wildlife. Usually the undergrowth around the big thicket hums with life, armadillos scurrying, squirrels chattering, birds flitting around, but everything was dead silent, like the entire preserve was holding its breath. I've never experienced that sort of absence before. You start to question whether you've slipped into some unseen corner of the world where the rules are different. I decided to check on a small clearing where I've found deer sign in the past. It's near a bend in Village Creek, relatively open, with tall loblolly pines on the edges. When I got there, I found more footprints, similar elongated prints that sank deep into the mud. But these tracks formed a distinct path leading deeper into a cluster of thick palmetto. My heart was hammering. I know folks say hunters are tough, but in that moment, I felt I was intruding on someone or something else's territory, and it knew I was there. I remember a local story about a father and son who disappeared off the Sundew Trail back in the 1970s. The official report said they got lost and never turned up. A family friend claimed they heard guttural shrieks echoing through the trees during that search. I'd always chalked it up to tall tales. But now I started to wonder if the thicket held more secrets than I'd cared to believe. I was about to leave when I heard branches snapping behind me. It wasn't just the crackle of dead wood from a wandering animal. It sounded methodical, like something large was taking each step with purpose. I froze, gripping my rifle, but part of me sensed that might not be enough if I actually came face to face with whatever was out there. My skin prickled, my breathing turned shallow. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was being watched, hunted even. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the tree line. I thought I caught sight of a face, almost human, but stretched too thin and lacking any warmth or humanity. Then the figure melted back into the shadows. My gut told me that sticking around any longer would be a mistake. I must have looked like a madman trudging back through the brush, stumbling over tree roots. On the walk out, I caught random wafts of a foul odor, like rotting meat left in the sun too long. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different. It clung to the air and followed me. I thought I heard my name whispered once, but I chalked that up to the wind. It was still enough to raise every hair on my neck. When I finally made it back to my truck, the sense of relief was overwhelming, but so was the feeling that something remained behind, still watching me from the cover of those twisted pines. On the drive home, I kept expecting something to lunge out of the roadside brush. I was beyond jumpy. Later, I called my cousin, told him what happened. He mentioned that some other folks in the area claimed to have heard unearthly wailing late at night, just beyond their property lines. One older woman, who keeps her windows open during mild nights, swears she heard frantic scratching on her shed door around 3 in the morning. She found marks the next day, tall up near the handle, like some animal was trying to get in. She can't figure out what would be that tall and still scratch like that. Now, I'm not saying for certain it was a Wendigo. I only know these prints were not anything I've come across in my years of hunting, and the presence I felt was so malevolent, it made every instinct in me scream to leave. I told a friend who's into cryptid research about it, and he brought up how the Big Thicket is rumored to be a crossroads of sorts, where different energies, creatures, or entities might converge. Some speak of interdimensional doorways, government cover-ups, and hidden labs. I don't know about all that, but I do know the feeling in the pit of my stomach wasn't just nerves. So for anyone venturing into those pines, keep your eyes open. Maybe it's just a strange set of tracks in the mud. Maybe it's a glimpse of something unexplainable slipping between the cypress knees. I was prepared to hunt that day, but whatever left those footprints, I'm convinced it was the true hunter in the woods. And I don't plan to test my luck crossing paths with it again anytime soon. The thicket's wildness always had a certain charm, until it suddenly felt evil and alive in a way I can't quite shake off. All along that stretch of Texas coastline, the warm Gulf breeze can lull travelers into a sense of calm. But sometimes, the wind carries more than the sound of gently rolling waves. Sometimes, it seems to bring whispers of something far older than the shifting sands. Something that has no intention of staying hidden. What you're about to hear is an account that may keep you from ever dozing off beneath a starry sky on Padre Island again. I've camped on Padre Island National Seashore near the Malaquite Visitor Center plenty of times, usually a tranquil spot to cast a line or watch the Kemp's Ridley sea turtles if you're lucky. This time, though, was different from the get-go. The air felt strangely thick that weekend, like a storm was coming, even though the forecast showed clear skies. I arrived mid-afternoon, around 2 p.m. if I recall correctly. I set up my tent further down from the more popular beaches. There's this one patch of dunes, maybe 5 miles south of the main paved area, where most folks in RVs don't bother going. I've always loved the isolation, but looking back now, I wish I'd stuck closer to the crowds. Everything went smoothly until dusk, when I noticed the absolute absence of people. I'm used to some folks driving by in 4x4s, maybe the occasional park ranger, but there was no one around. I should have recognized that as a sign. Around 9 p.m., I was stargazing by my small campfire. The tide was low, and the moon was bright enough that I could see quite a distance across the beach. Out of nowhere, I heard a splash, loud, like a body slamming into shallow water. At first I thought maybe it was a big fish or a dolphin stranding itself near shore, but I saw nothing. I stood there for a minute, scanning the shoreline, expecting to see a tailfin or some thrashing. Instead, I caught a glimpse of something dark and elongated slithering across the wet sand, then disappearing into the surf. I called out to see if anyone was in trouble. No response except the steady crash of the waves. My nerves were on edge, but I tried to talk myself into believing it was just a large ray or maybe a sea turtle. I resolved to check in with a park ranger in the morning. Later that night, past midnight I'd guess, I woke to what sounded like raspy breathing outside my tent. It didn't sound like any gull or coyote I'd ever heard. My heart started pounding. The old stories about sea monsters or cryptid creatures that sometimes wash up on Texas shores crossed my mind. People occasionally talk about discovering giant eels or bizarre deep-sea fish in the area, especially after storms. But this felt entirely different. The breathing continued for a few seconds, then silence. I worked up the courage to unzip my tent, shining my flashlight around, but there was no sign of anything. In the morning, I headed up to the ranger station at Malaquite. The ranger on duty seemed jumpy when I mentioned strange noises. He asked if I was messing around or if I'd been drinking. I told him I was serious. He said they'd had a few 911 calls forwarded from Corpus Christi dispatch in the last 2 weeks, people claiming they'd seen some fish-like creature crawling onto the beach at night. The calls ranged from frightened campers near Bird Island Basin to a local fisherman up by Whitecap Beach. None of them provided enough detail for an official investigation, and most folks thought it was a prank or a misidentification. Still, the ranger's face told me he suspected something bigger might be going on. That same afternoon, I met a local fisherman at a nearby bait shop on Park Road 22, close to the Flower Bluff area. He overheard me talking to the clerk about night fishing. He pulled me aside and told me he'd reeled in what he thought was a large tarpon a few nights ago, only the fish had disturbingly human-like eyes, and it let out a gurgling hiss when it slipped off his hook. He dropped the rod in shock, and the thing disappeared back into the waves. The fisherman looked genuinely shaken as he described it. He also mentioned that a friend of his, a guide who leads kayaking tours, claimed to have glimpsed a pale shape lurking beneath the surface near the Laguna Madre side of the island. The shape darted away whenever the kayak got too close. The more I heard, the more unsettled I became. That evening, I decided to stay one more night at my campsite, mainly because part of me wanted an explanation, foolish as that may sound. Around sunset, I drove my truck a bit further south, wanting to see if I'd spot anything along the shoreline. That's when I noticed a cluster of footprints, at least they appeared to be footprints, leading from the water's edge up into the dunes. They were wide and splayed, almost like a frog's foot, but larger than my own shoe. Some of them had deep impressions, implying something heavy had stepped there. My heart was in my throat the whole time I examined them. I took a few photos with my phone, but somehow, in my rush, they turned out blurry. Maybe because my hands shook. I followed the trail about 20 yards until it abruptly stopped. It was as if the creature had vanished or taken flight. The wind began picking up, blowing sand in my face, and I realized how alone I was out there. I got this prickly feeling along the back of my neck, like I was being watched from somewhere behind the dunes. In a panic, I jumped back in my truck and headed to the more populated area near the visitor center. I almost considered sleeping in the parking lot or driving straight back to Corpus Christi that night. I ended up grabbing a quick meal at a nearby gas station convenience store, my mind racing with all sorts of thoughts. Government experiments, mutated sea life, or maybe something ancient stirred up by changing ocean currents. Later, when I spoke with the local sheriff's deputy, he confirmed they'd fielded some bizarre calls. One was from a family camping near the Yarborough Pass who reported hearing frantic splashing and screeching noises. By the time authorities arrived, all they found was a set of shallow, round indentations in the sand. Another call came from a retired couple in the North Beach area who claimed a mer creature was lurking near their dock lights. The deputy hinted that the local police were inclined to shrug it off, but the word was traveling fast among the rangers and fishermen alike. I decided enough was enough and packed up the next morning. I've never peeled out of a campsite so quickly, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. Part of me wants to go back and look for more evidence. Another part is terrified that if I do, I'll meet whatever left those prints face to face, and that's not something I'm ready for. People might speculate about a mutated seal or an undiscovered species of eel or even a misidentified manatee, but there was an unmistakable presence, something that felt intelligent, aware, and definitely not welcoming. I keep running those nights over and over in my head, wondering if I missed clues or if I should have stayed silent and kept it to myself. Still, it's too unsettling not to share. If anyone else has encountered something similar on Padre Island or any other stretch of the Texas coast, I'd appreciate knowing I'm not alone. Because after this, my carefree beach camping days might be behind me. Even now, I sometimes dream of that raspy breathing outside my tent flap, and I wake up convinced I can still smell salt and seaweed in the air. I won't forget those footprints, or that feeling that something was watching from just beyond the surf. And I'm certain that if I ever do go back, I'll be looking over my shoulder the entire time. A quiet night on the seashore, interrupted by something unexpected breaking the surface. A shadow sliding onto the sand, leaving wide, splayed footprints and a creeping chill in the heart of a camper who can't unsee what he saw. Sometimes the ocean doesn't give up all its secrets so easily. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.